Are you good, John?
I'm good.
Okay, I think we'll get going then.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dave Lenox, University Architect and Director of Campus Planning and Design here at Stanford. And would like to welcome you to the Stanford Spring Lecture Series in Architecture, Landscape Architecture, and Urban Design. The theme of this year's series is Architecture of Joy. Now, in his book, The Architecture of Happiness, Alain de Botton replies and writes, it's perhaps when our lives are at their most problematic that we are likely to be most receptive to beautiful things. And that point was proven in March 2020 when many of us began sheltering in place. As we continue to emerge from this pandemic, let's reflect together on the incredible value of architecture in our lives. Our environment brings us joy, it inspires us, it reminds us of our full potential, both as individuals and as a community. With that sentiment in mind, we invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the inspirational work of our talented speaker. Before we begin, I just want to thank the rest of our team who has helped us organize the series. Zach Pozner, Director of Architecture, Dr. John Barton, the Director of the Stanford Architectural Design Program, Padma Kudetapudi, and Nick Golding for their support as well. I would also like to thank the American Institute of Architects Silicon Valley chapter for their help in advertising the series, as well as registering our program for continuing professional education. At the end of the lecture, your attendance will be automatically noted and submitted to the AIA. Our next lecture is in 2 weeks, and we're pleased to have Sarah Zudi from Studio Zudi, and it will be held virtually via a Zoom webinar just like today. So a little bit of housekeeping, the protocol for today's webinar. We've allocated 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the lecture for Q&A. Please use the Q&A section to post any questions you may have during the lecture. And Zach will group similar questions together and moderate and present them to the speaker as time permits. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce John Patkow. Patkau Architects is an innovative architecture and design research studio based in Vancouver, Canada. The firm was founded in 1978 by Patricia and John Patkau. They, along with their fellow principals, are responsible for directing the activities of the firm and providing design leadership throughout each project, from inception to completion. John's contributions to the practice of architecture have been well recognized by numerous awards, including the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada Gold Medal for Lifetime Achievement, and membership in the Order of Canada for significant contribution to Canadian culture. He's also been made an honorary fellow of the American Institute of Architects and an international fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. As a design leader at Patkau Architects, John has designed a wide variety of project types for a diverse range of clients in Canada, the United States, and the Middle East. His work encompasses intimate homes, cultural landmarks, sophisticated multi-institutional complexes, sculpture, and furniture. We are so excited to have him here to present his work tonight and share a bit of joy. So let's give a warm Stanford welcome to John Patkau.
Thank you very much, Dave. I can hear the thunderous welcome from everybody on mute, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to be giving you a presentation called Work and Play. And Work and Play is about both the work that we undertake for clients and the research that we do on our own initiative. But before I present this work, I'd like to give you a brief background, both on my partner, Patricia, and myself, as well as the firm. So I'd like to begin with a brief description of how we work. And I should say that to understand sort of some of the motivations behind the basic approach that we take, you might understand that Patricia and I both went to architecture school at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg in the late 1960s. And at that time, which is obviously a long time before the internet, Winnipeg was a small, very isolated city located in the middle of the continent, literally as far away as you could be in relation to both the East and the West Coast, where architecture in North America was primarily to be found. As a consequence, we learned a lifelong lesson of looking outward. So we began our practice with an outward perspective, looking without preconception for specificity in each building project as the basis for design intent. We called this approach a search for found potential. Found potential may include aspects of site, cultural context, urban conditions, local climate, regional building technology, or anything that describes the world into which a building must be fit. Working with these specific circumstances, we strive to develop an architectural form which is evocative of circumstance. So seeking potential, found potential to develop an architectural form evocative of circumstance is not merely a method for stirring inspiration. It is also a counterstance to the prevailing generalization in the built environment that promotes the universal while discounting the particular. Furthermore, our projects are fitted to their circumstances. As they are fitted to their circumstances, they tend to lack a consistent formal vocabulary. We believe this is an appropriate response to the diversity within which we live. With time, we have also come to recognize and appreciate the inward aspects of our practice. We understand that architectural form does not arise without a synthetic act of imagination. This act of imagination may express cultural aspiration, environmental concern, technological enthusiasm, or many other ideals. The more inclusive the acts of imagination, the more complete the work of architecture. So as we've developed a body of work, the work itself becomes an undeniable context, suggesting alternates and possibilities. Questions of craft become significant as we look at how things are made and reflect on how they are conceived and described. Craft for us is first an intellectual pursuit, a construction of ideas that undergird the development of a project. Craft is also aesthetic, a capacity for aligning cognitive and experiential sensibilities. And craft is physical, an expression of how well ideas and aesthetics align with practical reality.
Hey, John, this is Dave Lenox. Sorry to interrupt. Are you advancing slides or are you still on the first slide?
I'm still on the first slide.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
You caught me 20 words short of the next slide.
Darn. Okay, sorry about that.
So with this design approach as background to our ongoing practice, I would like to discuss a couple of recent projects. And then I would like to talk about a design research initiative which we've been engaged in for about the past 10 to 12 years. So with that, I'd like to talk about building projects. And the first project that I would like to talk about is a house. It's located on Quadra Island, which is a fairly remote island, a fair bit north of Vancouver in the Strait of Georgia. And this is the view of the Strait of Georgia that you see from the site. And this is the site plan of the house looking out toward the southeast and the Strait of Georgia, with the mainland to the east and Vancouver Island to the west. And so one of the interesting characteristics of the house is how rich a site it is. As I said, to the right hand, which is east on this slide, there is the open water of the Strait of Georgia. But to the south, there is a lagoon, which is a tidal basin, which is constantly changing throughout the day. To the north, there's a large mound, a rocky hillock of basalt. And to the west, there is a forest of native Douglas fir and large leaf maple trees. And so the obvious response to the site, which is certainly one that we adopted, is to create a spectacular panoramic view looking over the Strait of Georgia. However, that isn't really, in some ways, the key inspiration and specific that we took from the site. This is the beach below the house. The house itself is about 44 feet above the sea below. And this is a beach, and the beach is constantly being battered by high seas and storms. And so the boulders and the large tree trunks that you see here are constantly being rearranged, almost like a game of pickup sticks. And that sort of dynamic circumstance is what we chose to be our sort of major potential that we took from the site. And what we did was we organized the house, and I'm going to show you a sequence of slides which show how the house goes together. So the first thing is keeping in mind that the site is on the middle on the right-hand side. The access to the site is constructed by creating some rock retaining walls, which allow a roadway to come along the hill and then turn into the site. And next, we constructed a series of concrete structural walls. And you can see now that the geometry of the retaining walls and the concrete structural walls and the partitions which are coming in to describe spaces. In this case, they're describing secondary spaces like bedrooms and kitchen, which are to either side of the main flow of space. But you can begin to see that the geometry of the house has the looseness and randomness of the rocks and timbers that are strewn along the beach below. Here, what you see are ground plane described by triangular shards of concrete, retaining pool, and gravel courtyards. And finally, an envelope which encloses the house to construct the plan of the house, which wraps around this entry court and moves down to terrace living room below the concrete levels of the house, which is bracketed off the face of the cliff. And so here is a view of the house from above, from the adjacent rock mound, looking out over the house to the water beyond. The roof of the house is simply naturalizing with seeds and plant materials that are blown by the wind and dropped by the birds onto the gravel roof. And then we have the entry court for cars. And the entry court for cars is constrained by walls of the house and the fir and big leaf maple forest beyond with a gravel court. And moving from this space into the pedestrian world of the house interior, you pass by a pool. And this pool is completely natural water that simply flows through the house. It is the groundwater of the site. There are no pumps. It is simply groundwater that moves from the higher elevations to the left of this slide and drops below the house and to the ocean beyond. So moving past this reflecting pool, and from the entry to, which is in some ways the secondary entrance from the parking area, you enter into a passageway adjacent to the pool, but you begin to see through the house to the distant ocean beyond. And then moving into the house, the central sort of space that everything is connected to is a large dining room. It's also a meeting room, because the house not only is the winter residence for the owners, but it is the headquarters of a foundation which they established, which gives rise to the name of the house, the Tula House, the Tula Foundation, which is involved in environmental activities from the entire coast, from Mexico through Canada. And so moving from that space into the kitchen, which again, is characterized by this irregular geometry with things of different descriptions that are occupying different places, which overlooks the tidal basin to the south, or going on to view over the living room to the east, or into very almost monastic bedroom areas, which are accessible through apertures in the concrete walls which support the roof of the house. And so this is one of those bedrooms, and the windows in these rooms is, in the bedrooms, is always kept very low to create a very tranquil, contemplative kind of atmosphere. And here you begin to see some of the skylights that are within the house. And the skylights are always, and this is the bathroom, the skylights are always projections of the concrete walls. And so wherever you see a concrete wall stop, a slot of light continues on. So this is stepping down into the living room, looking across toward a study. You can see that there are actually large panels of glass in the floor, which allow you to look down on the beach to see the rock and timbers that are strewn along the beach. Stepping over this other glass panel, which occasionally gives you an opportunity to look down at deer as they cross below the house here. And so this is a study area and looking back toward the south. Again, through the living room and out to a deck, which is located on either end of this space. And so the house is bracketed off of the cliff. The living room is a different construction than the remainder of the house. And you can see from below the glass panels in the floor, which allow you to look up into the interior of the house. And the uninsulated floors of the deck areas are where the wood deck material is exposed. And so here, looking from the beach below, you look up to the house, you can see the two panels of glass, the decks on either end. And from that space, the bracketing of the structure to allow the living space to be out here. And so it's interesting, if you look at this particular view and you look at it at night, you don't see any other lights. And so there is zero habitation in this, except for this one house, which gives you some sense of how isolated it is. The other project that I want to show before we move to the research projects is an art museum for a private collection in Whistler, British Columbia. It's Michael Odin's art collection, hence the name of the museum, the Odin Art Museum. But does it start my video? Matthew, what? I've got a sign here says.
Yeah, John, I think we're not seeing your video right now. If you're able to do that.
Oh.
Can you turn camera on?
Okay.
You can see the slide.
Can you?
I just see the word John Patkow with a black background. Sorry.
Have you not seen anything?
Oh, there you are. All right. It's nice to see your face.
Oh,
sorry
okay.
to interrupt.
But have you been able to see the slides so far?
Yes. Yeah, we're seeing the slides, but we didn't see your face for a while. So you're all set now. Thanks.
Okay. Great. Sorry about that.
No worries.
So the next project is the Odin Art Museum, which is located in Whistler, British Columbia. And Whistler, as you may know, is a ski resort which has tremendous volumes of snow. And so I'm going to try and make this move, and it's not moving. Here. Good thing you're here, Matthew. Okay. So this is an aerial photograph. The museum is in red, the little squiggle in red. And you can see all the ski runs that are coming down from the mountain into the village. And the village itself is a very strange place in the sense that it's got a very contrived sort of Swiss village, ski village vernacular. And our site is actually located in a very interesting location because it's actually adjacent to the village and was donated by the municipality of Whistler for the museum in what was formerly a works yard. And so the museum itself sits in what is apparently a wooded site, but was actually open in the middle, which is where the building is sitting. And that site was formerly a works yard where piles of gravel, cars that have been impounded, machinery of various sorts was stored to maintain the village. And it's located between two large parking lots for the skiers. Although it's interesting that Whistler now has become as successful a summer resort as it was a winter resort, with lots of things like mountain biking and things of that nature. And then to the right of this slide, you see a creek called Fitzsimmons Creek. And that creek looks pretty modest where you see it, but it actually has the potential for enormous flooding. And so the museum is located to the, I guess it's the east of the road, which is a dike, and it's in the floodplain. And so the design of the museum was shaped by three really fundamental things. The first was the fact that there is at least 15 feet of accumulated snow in the wintertime in Whistler, and so the roof is designed to shed that enormous snow load. The creek can flood the site of the museum, and so we were required to design the museum to a 1 in 2,500 year event, which is a pretty significant flood. And so the museum is entirely elevated, sitting on large piers that keep the building off the ground. And finally, the collection, the permanent collection, which is Michael O'Dane's collection of art, which is exclusively from British Columbia, and a temporary exhibition area, which is devoted to art from everywhere. And so in order to approach the museum, you have to make the grade change from the dike to the museum across the floodplain, which was achieved by a bridge, which you can see in this building section, which takes you into an exterior porch. And that porch gives you access either to the lobby of the museum or down to the ground plane and to the meadow, which is adjacent to the museum itself. And there you can also see in this section that your view from the museum to this remaining site is at a second story height, which gives you a very interesting relationship to the vegetation. And so moving through the drawings, you can see that the building itself is very dark, it's almost black. And that was done intentionally to make it recede into the forest. We didn't want this large structure to be fighting its context. And the site, even though it was a works yard, has significant vegetation. In fact, the reason why Michael O'Dane chose this particular site was it was the most wooded site of the sites that were made available to him. And he wanted the natural context of that native forest, because so much of the art which is exhibited within the building, which is, as I said, restricted to the permanent collection to art from British Columbia, is nature-based. And it's also significantly First Nations. And so the context of this native forest was viewed as being essential for the museum. The other thing that you can see here, though, is that wherever we have opened the interior to the surrounding exterior to the site, we have clad the walls of the museum, which are in the gallery spaces, white, as is the convention, but we've clad all those walls with hemlock, which is a native species of evergreen tree. And even the porch, the exterior porch is clad with this hemlock, so that it is like, all of the openings are like glowing lanterns against the background of the dark forest and the dark building. And so here you see the approach to the museum across the bridge. You can see how powerful the natural hemlock cladding in the context of the dark forest and the dark building is an attractor. It's really, our notion was that it's a lantern which draws you into the building. You can see the porch drops down to the lower level, to the ground plane, and you can see the long passageway that runs to connect you from the lobby to the gallery spaces, and how strongly the presence of the wood, which is actually only present in a few areas, but it seems to characterize your experience very significantly. And so here you are looking down from the porch into the, down the amphitheater to the ground plane. You can see how the light comes into this space to make it glow, and how this space really explodes before taking you into the lobby, which you can see here from the level, from the second floor level, has a very strong and abstract relationship to the vegetation of the surrounding site, almost as if it were an artifact, a piece. In fact, there's a window which is very similar to a view from, which I'm going to show you at the end of this particular project description, which is named after one of British Columbia's most significant artists, because it's so characteristic of the types of paintings that he would make. And so moving along the passageway, which connects you from the lobby to the permanent and temporary exhibition spaces, you overlook the forest, which is remarkably integral. In fact, the building, the void in the forest that was provided by the works yard was in some ways so strategic, or the design was so responsive, that we only had to remove one large tree in order to put the building here. And the building is very tightly cradled by the forest that remains, so that you don't really understand that you're not in a forested site. In fact, you're in a site on the edge of Whistler Village in the context of these massive parking lots, but you really don't sense that. And so moving into the oldest part of the collection, these are First Nations works of art. These masks, some of them are 200 years old. They've mostly been repatriated to British Columbia from Europe and from the US, from collections to bring them home. And Michael is very strongly connected to the First Nations artists of British Columbia, and he makes all of these artifacts available to their tribes and their communities, so that they have access to come and to have very intimate interactions with the works when the museum is closed. And this is a large wall piece that it's a dancing screen, which Michael commissioned. In fact, the commission took place prior to even the idea of building this private museum, and then it was simply relocated from what was going to be a sculpture in his summer cottage, hard to imagine, but in his summer cottage to the museum. And the little figure that you see carved with the hand raised is a door. And when that door opens, dancers from behind the screen come through, and it is a dancing screen, and they perform, and then they retreat back through the door when the performance is over. The conventional galleries are very sort of clean, modern, normal galleries. Certainly something that you would see in most contemporary museums. This is the traveling exhibit. And so here you have a show which happens to be historical. That's very unusual. Yet the circulation has within it some monumental carvings like this mask by Robert Davidson, which can work in the natural light and the sort of robust character of the wood interior, as opposed to the white pristine spaces of the gallery. And a stair which takes you up to the upper level of the galleries. And so the roof, the pitched roof, is home to the administration and all back of house. And then at one end is also for the temporary exhibits. And this is the end that looks out over the site across to the forest adjacent, which you see here. And this is the Gordon Smith window that I described earlier on. So I'd like to talk a little bit about our research projects. They're very different than our architectural projects because they don't have a site typically, and they are not shaped by the found potential. They're shaped by other things. The research actually began early on in the late 80s and the 90s with the construction of models like this model. And these models were not designed to describe the project. They were designed to sort of interrogate the project. They were fragmentary models that tore apart the building to reveal the more fundamental sort of formal characteristics of the building. And in doing this, we often learned a great deal which informed subsequent projects. However, at some point, we stopped making those models because I guess the digital world overtook us. And for a while, our research activities were quiet. We had stopped building those analytical models, and we weren't really doing anything much. But then we were asked to undertake a project which sparked a whole new line of research. And what you see here is a page from a book called Relational Operations, which we published with Princeton Architectural Press a few years ago. And this book is a compilation of little projects that by and large we undertook ourselves, which explore the nature of materials and how, by virtue of certain kinds of manipulations, you can take a material and form it into a space and a structure. And the instigation of this whole line of research was a program actually in our hometown of Winnipeg, which was for shelters from the wind for skaters on the frozen river. In the winter, the river is plowed. The dashed lines that you see represent the track that you can skate. And a program called the Skating Shelters was instigated. Our shelters were in the second year, and the program continues to this day. So it's been going on for maybe 12 or 14 years now. And so we were asked to design a shelter, and we began to try and understand what you would do for a temporary structure on a frozen river that would protect people from the wind. And we tried to think about how to react to the need for a light structure that you could fabricate somewhere and then drive out onto the river, a structure that would protect people from the wind and would deal with snow. And so these are sort of little sort of thought pieces which take minimal things and turn them into space and structure. On the one hand, you see this net, which by being stabilized with a skewer, a wooden skewer, takes on volume and becomes a space, or even this little piece of plastic, which with an elastic band becomes a curved sheet of plastic and stands up and has the ability to describe space and to be a structure. And so in an attempt to try and capture those things with as minimal materials as possible, we began playing with pieces of wood veneer. And you can see the idea here of taking sheets of veneer and then attaching them to a structure like the base, which is some sort of rigid structure, but the veneer is simply bent to form the vertical walls and the enclosure. We realized that we would have to move to large scale very quickly and really work at scale in order to develop this project. And so we bought the thinnest pieces of plywood we could buy and tried to make something, and it just didn't work. We weren't able to capture the curvature that the veneer allowed us, or the scale. It wasn't big enough for people to inhabit the 4x8 sheets. And so we began to try and understand what we were really trying to build with. And it became clear to us that plywood, or at least conventional plywood, was the wrong material, because plywood is isotropic, which is to say that it's made up of plies in both directions. And so it tends to be quite stiff. You can't really bend a sheet of plywood very easily. Certainly at a scale, you can modestly bend sort of a 1/4 inch or maybe even a 3/8 inch piece of plywood, but not very significantly. We did find a material, though, that was called Bendy Ply. And Bendy Ply is made up of light plywood, plies in opposite directions, but only 3 plies, where the 2 perimeter plies are stiffer material that are oriented either along the sheet or across the sheet. You can get it both ways, but the interior ply is very weak. And so you can bend this very much like veneer, because veneer is not isotropic, it's anisotropic. It has strength in one direction and weakness in the other direction, which allows it to be bent when you sort of across the grain. And by taking sheets of Bendy Ply and sort of lagging them together, which you see on the top of these images, and attaching those aggregated sheets of Bendy Ply to the sort of the ribs that you see below, we were able to construct a volume that very much replicated the character of the veneer study models. And we looked at, and here you see it, and we looked at how all of the details could be achieved in sort of full scale. Where things cracked, we had to introduce slots. Where things needed to bend into one another, we sometimes peeled off layers, and you can see those things here. This is how we avoid cracking where the curvature is too great by cutting in a slot. Where the plywood comes together and collapses on itself, we simply chopped it off to create this opening. Where we only had a single layer of the Bendy Ply, we perforated it to allow that to enrich the experience of the shelter. And where the Bendy Ply is attached to the wood base, we actually notched the base to acknowledge the different layers of the Bendy Ply. And so here you see our mock-up, and this was designed sort of at full scale, sort of fixing failures to create this volume. Once we had created this volume, we took it apart and we measured it. In fact, the pieces that you see here that describe the sides of the skating shelter are actually hanging up on the wall of our studio right now. And so by making these measured drawings of the pieces that we had sort of resolved the volume into, we were able to construct a set of drawings for the fabrication of the shelters in Winnipeg, which is a long way from here on the coast. And also we described, our budget was modest, but we were able to afford enough Bendy Ply, the labor was free, to construct 6 of these shelters. And we studied their relationship to one another so that they sheltered each other and created this sense of community, this aggregation, this sort of buffalo herd or flock of things. And so here they are on site. My really good friend who does art photography went to Winnipeg. It was minus 30 degrees that day. That was the high. And so there weren't many skaters out that day. There were a few, but he deserves a medal for braving that kind of temperature. And here you see our 6 skating shelters out on the river. A few hardy souls skating by in the really, really miserable cold. The skating shelters as they were intended, but they are provocative and very interesting communal characters that have a lot of interest, which comes from the juxtaposition of one shelter to another. I think that on their own, they're much less provocative than they are as a group. Even the little stools we designed for the interiors are predicated on the same principle of bending a sheet of Bendy Ply around some kind of base. And so at the end of the day, when the temperature had dropped to minus 40 degrees, my friend Jimmy Dow, the photographer, went above and beyond the call of duty and bought a bunch of lanterns and put the lanterns inside the shelters and took this final shot. And this shot became very popular, so popular that when the Victoria and Albert Museum in London were putting on a show called Plywood, Material of the Modern World, they asked us for permission to reconstruct the Bendy Ply shelters in the courtyard, which you see right here. It was a very interesting show, especially for architects, and it was interesting to see the shelters in a very, very different kind of context. So while the shelters project was going on, I was teaching a studio at Yale University, and the project that we were doing was a workshop for the Eli Whitney Museum in Hamden, Connecticut, which is right next door to Yale. And we went over there, the class went over there, and we met the director of the museum, a fellow by the name of Bill Brown. And for some reason, which I don't fully understand, he said to me, "You have to see the video between the folds." And I thought to myself, okay, a video on origami. I don't understand why this would be interesting to me, but okay, I'll look at it. And it was fascinating. And origami, as you know, is made of folding paper. And there are many classic forms, and people are inventing new forms all the time. And sort of the virtuosity of you as an origami artist is driven by the number of folds, how complex the object is. But Paul Jackson, who was interviewed on the video, who is an origami artist who was teaching at the time in Israel, was asked by his class, can you make an origami figure with just one fold? And his initial reaction was no. Origami is many folds. In fact, the more folds you make, the more accomplished you are. But he thought about this, and this is what he came up with. This is our recreation of his idea, which is that if you take origami and you take a sheet of paper and you fold it once, and then you break the fold by pushing on it, and you then create a structure. And that structure is standing up on the image on the right. And you can do this with paper because its fibrous nature allows you to break the fold. And so it was interesting. We were still trying to figure out what it was we were doing, but I was sort of challenged by this, and I decided to see whether I could do this and do this in sheet metal. And so I got some 22 gauge sheet metal and I cut a hole in the middle of it and I folded it. And then I was able, because of the hole, to force the light gauge steel to break at that point, just like the paper did. Steel, as you know, is very different than paper, and it doesn't have the fibrous structure which can be sort of stretched and almost torn without it actually breaking. The crystalline structure of steel makes it very unhappy when you attempt to do something like that. In fact, as you also probably know, when you fold a piece of steel, the fold is remarkably strong. It's a very, very rigid structure. And so when I did this, I said, okay, so that's interesting. I sort of was facilitated by the hole, but maybe not. So I took this to a number of shops. This is a shop in my office, but I took this to a number of steel fabricators. And I said to them, can you do this only with a much larger sheet of steel? I want to make a structure, a large structure, or sort of architectural scale, because I was really interested in moving these sort of studies into building scale. And they said, well, certainly what we would do is we would cut the thing into pieces, we would roll it, and then we weld the pieces back together. And I said, no, that's exactly what I don't want, because I want the curves to be the curves that spring out of the folding process, out of the folding, the breaking of the fold. That force, which is embedded in the steel, resolves itself into these curves, which are natural curves. I don't want some contrived roller curve. And they said, well, no, we can't do that. And so I worked together with a couple of people. One was a student and the other was an intern in our office. And we played with this and we began building steel sheet metal brakes. And you can see here a diagram which shows the evolution of these brakes, starting from the simplest small one, moving up to a very large one. And so we began by this idea of making a form which would be where you put a sheet of steel with a hole in the middle of it where a bolt is located. We tighten the bolt, we draw the two pieces of the brake together and the steel would fold and you would get something that looks like this. And so it would essentially accomplish what the origami figure had in a very sort of modest way. We became sort of challenged to continue to refine the form. And instead of the hole in the middle with the bolt, we decided to make two brakes that would be joined end to end, and we would be clamping the steel not at the break point, not at the place where we broke the fold, but adjacent to that. And that started to produce much more dramatic forms. And finally, we were working with sheets, much larger sheets, and we were getting these very interesting curvilinear vaulted shapes. And finally, and here you can see them in our courtyard where we had moved to work for the space. Finally, we built one that was capable of breaking a 5-foot by 12-foot sheet of stainless steel, which we developed. You can see that there are a whole array of bolts, which we use to pull the two sides of the two brakes together, and a hinge point where at the middle where we wanted to break the fold. And so here is the machine being installed in our courtyard, the sheet of stainless steel being brought into the machine, the two machines being, the bolts being tightened incrementally, a motor, an engine hoist used to pull the whole form up as we were continuing the breaking. And you can see now that we have a form which is made of a 12 foot by 5 foot sheet of stainless steel, which has been broken and folded. The break has been broken twice. And the curves and the vaulted structure that you see here is entirely driven by the forces that were embedded in the steel by the folding and breaking. And they are completely natural curves, which are very, very elegant. And so we projected doubling the size of the 5 by 12 to 10 by 24 and getting vaulted structures of this kind. And we continued to look around, but we couldn't find anybody who had 5 or 10 by 24 sheets like this. And so the project really didn't get beyond the 5 by 12 size, which is not nothing. It certainly is a significant structure. At that point, we got a call from Tokyo, from Comme des Garçons, the fashion house. And the director of the fashion house, Rei Kawakuba, who you see here, had seen photographs, the lantern-like photograph of the skating shelters, and she was enamored with these skating shelters. And she said, could we make her some objects like this for her new showroom in Tokyo, except they can't be made of wood because of the fire code in Tokyo. They have to be made of something non-combustible. And we said, absolutely, we could do that because and by the way, we thought that she liked our shelters because they maybe reminded her a little bit of some of the things that she was doing. But we had made this form, and if you take that form and you stand it on end, we thought you would get the objects that she was looking for. She was looking for something that could be either a change room or a little display pod. And here you can see them at the figure inside, the one on the left demonstrates how the size of these two stainless steel shells that are clustered together. And we sent photographs of these. And it's interesting, what you see here is light plastic, sheets plastic, which we spray paint to look like steel. And it's amazing how this plastic performs very like the steel. It really replicates the geometry and the behavior of the steel. But she said no, they were too artistic. She wanted something more, less sort of exuberant. And so we said, okay, we'll do something, I guess, more like the skating shelters. And here you see our proposal, her final accepted proposal to her. These are stainless steel shells that we would fabricate here in Vancouver and ship to Tokyo, where they would be assembled and on her showroom floor. And so, like the skating shelters, which had been reverse engineered by taking them apart and making patterns, here we predicted that we could make patterns from the little models. And those patterns, which you see here, could be used at the scale of the 5 by 12 foot sheets of stainless to form the shells. And so here we have the base, and here we have sort of the ribs, but unlike the skating shelters, which were sort of lagged onto the ribs, we folded the sheets of stainless so that they could be bolted to the rib. And so here are the final shapes, and you see the dashed lines on these final very sort of interesting curvilinear shapes, which are the straight lines where we break the steel so that it's perpendicular to the sheet itself and can be bolted onto these stainless steel plates that are the joints. And so here you see in the shop where what we call cocoon is being assembled. There are many interesting sort of lessons that we learned in the construction of these beyond what we had learned in the skating shelters because of the nature of steel. And one of the real issues that we had to deal with was the fact that these structures had to be constructed and then taken apart so that they could be shipped to Tokyo and reassembled on the shop floor. They couldn't be taken full size, even though they were shipped that way, because the route to the exhibition floor was a stairway that was too narrow for the object itself. And so here we are in process, and we tried to stiffen the edge and make it less sharp than the single sheet of stainless by lagging a plate onto it. And we came to realize that the curvature of these things was very three-dimensional, and the bar that we were trying to attach to stiffen the edge wasn't conforming to that. And ultimately, we understood that we needed to use a rod, because a rod can actually be attached around its circumference as it moves along the edge of the sheet. And so that's a lesson we've used on subsequent architectural projects where we have had this issue. And so here you see the rods that have been welded into the edge of the sheet. And then we had to construct a door, which proved to be a real challenge. We wanted to, because one of them was going to be a change room. And so we constructed a frame, which you see in red, out of the steel rods again. And then we had to actually figure it out. We built one in wood so that we could play with dowel to try and construct a door. And on the right, at the bottom, you can see the door we ultimately constructed out of steel rod and a translucent fabric. And the base of the cocoon became a translucent sheet of plastic sitting above some lighting, which allowed us to illuminate the interior of the cocoon, which you see here. And you can see that it's really quite a remarkable thing. These are flat sheets which haven't been rolled. They have simply been attached to one another at the folds. And so on the bottom left-hand corner, you see a spine, which has got two plates of steel with two folds clamped in between. And as you clamp these and you close them on each other, they naturally spring into these curvilinear forms. So it's what we call a sprung form, which is a term, an engineering term, which is often used for a structure where the form is only held in place and will return to a flat if the force is removed from it. And so the assemblage of these cocoons. And so images of the final objects before they were shipped to Japan. And so what we had learned from this, once there in the showroom, what we had learned was that if you take a material and you apply a force to it and you deform it, it takes on structural capacity that it previously didn't have if the forming is appropriate, and the force is maintained. And with the sprung form figures like the skating shelters and the cocoon, we were able to hold the forces in place with the frames, and they were really what are called elastic bending. They return to, if you take them apart, which we did with the skating shelters, and which we have hanging flat on the wall, they return to their original shape. Whereas the one fold, the arch that we constructed, which has a permanent fold in it, is really a plastic bend, which introduces a permanent deformation and therefore a different kind of structural strategy. But all of these things were limited in size by virtue of the sheets of sheet material that we could get. And we wanted to move to an architectural scale. And so we had to sort of think about a different way of accomplishing this. And so we realized that we could do something which was much, much larger by using the notion of a ruled surface. And a ruled surface is something which is a curvilinear surface made of where at every point, or at certain points at least, if it's you can put a straight line on it. And so what we decided to do was to do a theoretical project for a retaining wall. In fact, two retaining walls, which would describe a space between them. And so here you see the shape of the retaining wall. You can see the plan form in white below, which is the stairway that takes you down through the space between the two retaining walls. And then the dashed lines represent the top of the retaining wall. And the notion is that as the forces on the structure become greater as you drop down the retaining wall, the undulations become more frequent in order to add stiffness to the wall. And so the way you do it, so the principle is, all the previous ones where we bent a sheet, we called morphological forces or morphological operations. And this was not morphological because we were simply locating pieces of material adjacent to one another to describe a surface that would, which is made of other things. So it's accomplishing the curvilinear shape with other means, and we call these relational operations. And so here is the idea. You construct a set of forms, in this case, forms described by these vertical trusses, which have guides on them, which support a 2x6 material, which is simply straight boards, which are attached. And then you shotcrete these forms. And then once the concrete is cured, you remove the wood and the 2x6s, which are all straight, and you get this resulting curvilinear geometry of these retaining walls. And so you accomplish the structural effect of a deformed surface through other means, which allows you to scale up to the scale of structures of architecture. And so with that idea, we began to look for opportunities to apply this notion to buildings. And there was a design competition, an ideas competition for a library in Korea that was available that summer. And we decided that we would make a proposal for the ideas competition, taking advantage of the idea of these relational armatures that would become the structure that would, where material plus force equals form, I should say, form and structure. And so the top array across is a sheet that is being deformed like the arch that we made, or at the bottom, they are pieces of wood that are put together in changing relationship to describe a similar structural shape. And so the notion of our competition entry was to take wood members, which you see here, and attach them to one another to create walls and roofs that moved relative to each other to create these large sweeping curved surfaces. And so here you see a model which we constructed in our office of our design, which is made entirely of these straight pieces of wood, which are attached to one another to describe these large curvilinear shapes, which are vaults. In fact, these structures are very, very large composite structures of wood and a concrete skin, so that they have a diaphragm, which are extremely efficient. And we've developed into ideas which I think are very practical. And so here, the section through the building it shows you a really provocative thing. If you cut the section in one direction, you see that everything is made of straight lines. But if you cut it perpendicular, you see that all of those straight lines have been adjusted relatively to each other to describe these large-scale curves. And these large-scale curves create vaulted structures, very, very strong, beautiful structures made entirely of straight pieces of wood. And so the final project that I'm going to show you today is a project that we constructed, and I'll show you photographs of it using that very idea. It's for an ashram in southeastern British Columbia, which was founded in the 1960s, as you might imagine. This is a yoga ashram, and on the left you see the founders. They're a group of women, and this is a community. It's called Yosadhara Ashram. It's still going strong, and it's still a matriarchal society where the leadership is always women. You see, moving across the image, the construction of an early temple, which was a gathering and contemplation space. You see then a fire which occurred in the temple, which caused them to have to demolish it. And then you see what I think is an incredibly beautiful structure. Unfortunately, not environmental. It heats up to enormous temperatures in the summer and is unbearable in the winter, but it was a temporary structure made of polyethylene and 2x4s. However, we were asked to construct a very high performance long-term facility. This is a net zero community. It's a very high performing building. And so the structure that we designed and the vaulted form that we designed had to meet very high standards. The idea was that we would build another dome, a replacement to the dome that had burned, and we would actually use this exact foundations of that previous structure. But unlike the dome, which was a traditional octagonal dome, which to us seemed actually quite masculine in character, we wanted to create a much more organic form that would reflect the fact that this community was a matriarchal society. And so we began to play with our idea of a wood structure made of straight members, sort of moving in relationship to one another to describe a curvilinear form. And in order to do that and actually accomplish the dome-like form, we had to divide it into 8 petals, each petal sitting on one of the former footings for the previous temple, as well as an adjacent auxiliary building. And so here you see a section through the temple. The structure is based on 8 half arches or 4 arches of glulam, onto which our petals, our 8 petals are attached. And so the section taken a little bit around the corner shows the petals being intersected, and as well as the principal archways and the auxiliary building, which is more conventional in construction. And the notion is that you would have trusses. The glulams started out as steel trusses, but for cost reasons became glulams with a bit of steel to accomplish some of the complexity. And the arches were different shape, top and bottom. And then we would connect the bottoms of one arch to the tops of the adjacent arch. And by going from a simple curve to a double curve from the underside to the top with straight pieces, we were able to construct an undulating form. And by cutting that undulating form off in a curvilinear shape, we were able to give the whole thing an additionally sort of curvilinear character, and then we cut openings in to provide glazing. And so the structure which you begin to see here is made up of straight pieces of engineered wood members and plywood skins, which act as a diaphragm. And so here you see the thing coming together, and this is a section. It's, as I said, the performance standards are very high. There is 14 inches of volume in the pedal itself, which is fully insulated to provide high standards of insulation. The glazing is all triple glazed. And here is the shop drawing from the company, which is called Spearhead, which with great good luck is simply across the lake from the temple. And so we were able to get these really sophisticated builders to construct the pedals and erect them on the foundations of the existing building. And here you see their shop, and you can see the straight pieces of material that are being put together. This one curved piece is an exception where the glazing is cut in, and you can see how the pedal is put together. And then moved into their warehouse, and then coated with a paint-on membrane, which is pre-coated in the shop and then final coated on site. And then moving out to the site, you have the primary structures, which are now a glue lam with a short pony wall on top at the top and some remaining steel at the bottom. You see the pedals starting to be attached to this primary frame. You can see that the structure is actually fairly light for this size of volume. And the structure, what you would take to be the structure, which are the straight pieces of LVL, are actually rotated so that they're not performing significantly in terms of gravity. It's the plywood that is doing that. They are simply stiffening the plywood and holding it into its curvilinear form, which you can see here, with an oculus at the top, which was a characteristic of the original temple that was required. And then the final structure overlooking the lake and looking across to where the structure had been fabricated. And so in the context of the forest, here you see that curvilinear pedal, this vault-like form, which has been constructed almost entirely out of straight pieces of wood with a plywood diaphragm, in this case, light plywood, 2 layers of light plywood that can bend somewhat, not nearly to the extent of the skating shelters, but enough to describe these curvilinear vaults. And then by virtue of the visual trickery of cutting a curving edge, the structure appears to be extremely curvilinear in character. And then moving into the interior, here you see the diagram of what this is, which is the ceiling of the entryway, which is defined by straight pieces of wood, even though it does create a curvilinear surface. And so moving on into the temple itself, the temple is actually a remarkably successful performance space for music as well as other kinds of performance, which is unusual because domes are very bad from an acoustical point of view. But the 8 pedals are fragmented enough, and the I call it the acoustic chandelier of these cones of absorption that we drop within the space results in an acoustic environment which is proven to be very good for sound. And even the drywall, which is simply 3/8 inch drywall, which has been applied to the straight pieces of wood, in some cases soaked to be more pliable, but again, flat pieces of material that are used to create these curvilinear forms. And here the project is being used and in its environment. And with that, I would like to thank you very much and welcome any questions.
Thanks, John. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, get some water. That was That was an hour of nonstop talking. You need a break.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to try and see if I can. I was just jotting down questions as you went along, and now I'm going to try and see if I can work my way from the beginning of your career to the end. Try and bring some chronological order to this conversation. And I encourage anybody who's still on to submit a question through Q&A. You know, it's interesting. It's like I went to a rock concert and you didn't play your greatest hits. You played the new album. It's a lot of the more recent stuff, which is so different from the early stuff. So I've been thinking about that a lot. Who are some of your influences, you know, either iconic architects that resonated with you, you know, as a student or earlier in your career, or mentors that you had along the way?
Well, I mean, as I said in the early description, we were located in a place which caused us to look outward. We were very, very interested in what was going on everywhere. And unlike growing up in a community, let's say Barcelona, which has such a strong tradition that it's fulfilling just in itself, growing up in Winnipeg made us curious about every other place. And so we looked at everything. We traveled extensively. We visited many architects. We were inspired by architects, and that inspiration has changed over time. As a student, I was interested in sort of the heroes of the time, and I looked very closely at, especially at Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier, although I was very interested in Alvar Aalto as well, and grew to enjoy his work more after having seen it. But as and we traveled a lot, so we saw a lot, and so somebody who I was amazed about early on, who's become actually much more significant to me now, is Antonio Gaudi, because the wild and crazy and expressive nature of his work is actually highly mathematical and very, very scientific. And all those forms and craziness are driven by sound engineering and geometric sort of analysis and understanding. I mean, the fact that he could do that without computers is truly impressive. So, I mean, in a sense, during all of this experimentation, which we've been doing the last decade, I've been interested in Gaudi as an example. But in between Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier and Alvar Aalto and Gaudi, there's been an endless parade. One of my heroes was a virtuoso, Enrique Moraes, who I've really been impressed by, and certainly we did a school which I think I'm very pleased with, is called the Strawberry Vale School in the mid-90s, which was, I think, shaped a little bit by our admiration of his work. There have been many, and I'm enthusiastic about lots of architects who are practicing today. I mean, I think that there's so many good architects out there, and there's so much you can learn. I really sort of find it one of the rewarding parts of the profession is how much you can learn from your peers and how rich it is to travel to places and see historical and contemporary work. And you know, I've been to Japan many times, and both the historical buildings of Japan as well as the contemporary sort of edgy work in Japan is something that I've learned a lot from. The list is endless, but that's the point. There's a lot of stuff out there you can learn from.
I think it's reflected in your work. You know, you haven't stayed still and kept pumping out the same partie or the same material palette. It's an evolution, and you captured that really well tonight. Yeah, the Gaudi stuff is amazing. I love how at Sagrada Familia they have all those models that he built with the sandbags and the mirrors. It reminds me of some of the stuff you're working on now. Is there something distinct to, you know, the Pacific Northwest where you've lived and practiced for your career? Most of your projects, I think, are pretty close by. Is there something distinct about the culture up there, or the weather, or the natural environment that you think tracks through your work over the years?
Well, yeah, I think definitely. I mean, we're here because of landscape. Both Patricia and I are amateur landscape architects. We really should have been landscape architects, and we're here because of the spectacular West Coast mountains and ocean, and that has informed our work. I mean, a lot of our projects are in very strong natural sites, and the language of our work has responded to that. And so that's certainly something that has become strong in our work because of where we are. We've done actually a lot of work in Eastern Canada. We've got probably as much work in Ontario and Quebec as we do in BC. And that work is much more urban in character. I didn't show it, but I in other lectures I do. And we do, I would say that we do more work in the city than we do in nature. It just so happens that this lecture tonight was located more in the natural context. In the urban context, our language becomes much more restrained and sort of respectful of community. I'm not sure that I would want buildings to be as flamboyant and exaggerated as the work I showed today in an urban context. I think that there is a need for restraint and greater quietness. And so our work, and as I said at the beginning, our work is driven by circumstance, and it changes with changing circumstance. And so the urban work is much more straight, but hopefully very rigorous.
Yeah, I mean, I think rigor is definitely showing across all your projects. I mean, you've definitely moved from much more rectilinear, a lot of angles in a lot of the residential projects initially, to a fascination with more sculptural and the origami, the sort of folding, and the fascination with these material applications and making them more plastic. Why do you think that change happened somewhere along the way?
Yeah, why did it happen? That's an interesting question. When we were doing the skating shelters, which started the interest in curves, I was also teaching, and I was observing that there were numbers of studios which were very digitally oriented, and where there was a lot of if not parametric work, at least digitally, Rhino and programs like that. And they were very curvilinear. And I would often ask students in reviews, how would you build that? Or what would you build it out of? And they didn't have an answer to either of those questions. And part of our interest in these geometrically complex buildings is to answer that question. That you can, it's not, you don't, like one of the instructors said, well, I'm just going to design it and then the world will catch up to me and figure out a way to build it. And I thought, well, that's one approach, but maybe a more practical approach is to figure out how to build it. And so our curvilinear things come out of a way of building, not a digital program. We use digital programs extensively, and it is a digital-based office, but we try and let the material drive the form, and so the capacity of the material to do things is our limit for us. I think that we are doing the curve shapes to demonstrate that they can be constructed with pretty conventional means, with pretty conventional budgets. I mean, when you build a vault like the temple out of plywood and LVLs, it's a different proposition than, you know, I know that, for example, the form that Sana used for the project in Switzerland, I forget the name of it, the watch company. Anyway, that form was made being entirely carved out of foam, put up on a scaffolding. And so every curve was simply carved by a CNC machine. And this enormous foam thing was then captured in a reinforced concrete shell. And to me, that's a remarkably expensive idea. And all that foam is just garbage. All the formwork has to be thrown away. And so finding, and I'm not, that's fine, and the projects are remarkable. But for me, the idea of finding a way to actually build them more directly was of interest. And I'm certainly, I've always been interested in how you make things. And everything that we do is predicated on understanding the nature of the materials and using them appropriately.
Yeah, I think your process is fundamentally different from Gary, for instance, who a lot of times was just playing around with paper and then passed it off to a team of engineers and said, figure out how to make this in reality. And then it becomes a fabrication issue and an engineering issue.
Yeah.
From what it seemed,
I think that's true. That's true.
Yeah, it seems more like in your world, you're sort of, I'm fascinated with this material and the way that it behaves. Let's see what we can do to exploit that to come up with something we really love, and then really figure out how to make it work in real life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's right. I know that. I mean, it takes remarkable resourcefulness to build a Gary building. I mean, it's a major accomplishment to do that. And I know that they have used principles like ruled surfaces and things like that to try and make their things more constructible. But they don't start out with that. They start out with, as you say, some folded paper or something like that is then transposed into another medium.
Yeah. So one thing I always like to ask is what you would say to new young architects and students so that they keep holding on to this joy that you have in experimentation and go out into their careers. Yeah,
well, you know, life is short, but life is long. And in order to have a long career, a long, interesting career, you have to have a lot of modesty and humility in the face of a discipline which is so phenomenally rich. But also, I think the desire to move along. We've always been changing from the very outset. We certainly have attempted to maintain a highly rigorous standard throughout, but we've always attempted to move on to something else. I don't think, well, there are a few projects which are similar to one another, but if you look at the entire body of work, it's virtually a continuous evolution and change. There's very little repetition.
Yeah, I think you're very different in a lot of ways from many of the architects we've had speak. And my observation is typically that, you know, great architects keep refining and editing and refining more and more and more. And, you know, maybe it's just that early in our design careers, we have too many ideas and we don't know how to edit. And so the craft is really about getting all of the extraneous stuff out of the way.
Yep.
But I think you've managed to keep refining, but also keep exploring. And that's the most compelling and inspirational part of your talk tonight.
Well, that's what we're trying to do. Definitely.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And, you know, I really appreciate your time and encourage everybody to take a look at your website and the whole canon of work, which is much broader than what you shared tonight. But it's really interesting to reflect back on the whole body of work and see the evolution, because I think that's the most interesting thing about what you're doing in your practice right now.
Well, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, John. Have a good night.
All right. Bye.
Bye.